the debt is unsustainable. And it was only a couple of trillion back then, but here it is now 35 trillion. And people think, well, you see, well, what's the problem? Why can't it go to 100 trillion? It got to 35 trillion. And so people just have a false sense of complacency that it's gone on for this long, so it's going to go on forever. And, it won't. Nothing that's unsustainable is going to go on forever. The fact that it's gone on as long as it has, though, has gotten people to believe that. But it just means that, we're that much closer to the collapse. And when it happens, it's going to be even worse because we're collapsing from a much higher level, right? We have a much bigger bubble now. And so it's far more catastrophic when the air comes out than would have been the case had it happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And in fact, the more catastrophic it obviously is, the more pressure there is on the powers that be to delay it even more. Because it's like so bad. I mean, we keep saying, well, it's our dollar, it's your problem. And to an extent, it is everybody's problem. But the longer they stay with it, the bigger that problem gets. And we certainly accelerated it by weaponizing the dollar. I mean, as if people didn't have enough economic reasons to de-dollarize. Biden gave them a big political reason to do that by weaponizing it, by threatening sanctions and to kick you off of SWIFT or to confiscate your treasuries. Pretty much we told the world, get rid of your dollars, right? I mean, that's what, which is the dumbest thing that we could have done, because that's the only reason that the whole thing isn't imploding, because the world has been dumb enough to stockpile our dollars. And we just gave them another powerful incentive not to do that. So we know it's happening. The question is, when will the pace quicken? And I think as the dollar starts to fall, and it's just started now, again, the dollar index is off about 10% from its peak, which is set a little over a year and a half ago. And again, we're close to an all-time record low against the Swiss franc. We only have to drop another maybe 7.5% to hit an all-time record low. And that's going to be the first currency, I think, that the dollar hits a record low in. But it's not going to be the last. More currencies. But I think once the dollar index really starts to break down, maybe the breaking point is 80, maybe it's 70, somewhere around there. But once the dollar starts to fall faster, and when inflation rears its head in a bigger way in the US, but the Fed doesn't do anything about it because we're in recession and the unemployment rate is up, and the world kind of, comes to this conclusion that, we can't pay, inflation is never going away, and, the last man, stuck with dollars is the loser, right? Right now, people, the central banks around the world are slowly divesting of dollars because there's no real urgency, right? The dollar's not crashing, and so they can slowly work their way out of the problem. But as the dollar starts to fall more, it creates a bigger sense of urgency that I better get out, because the longer I sit here, the more I'm going to lose. And so that's going to accelerate the rush to get out of the dollar, which is why eventually it's just going to implode, because now so many people want to get out and there's nobody to get in to take the other side of the trade. Well, remember, we have built this consumer-focused economy based on the dollar's reserve status. Better than 70% of our GDP comes from Americans just spending money. And they spend a lot of that money on imports. And so when the dollar crashes, those imports are just not coming in anymore. And so all of these stores are just going to have empty shelves. And so when there's empty shelves, they don't need their employees anymore, right? So, this whole service sector economy is going to be the hardest hit by the dollar crash, right? Because the consumption is going to come to an end. And that's the lion's share of our phony economy. It's all based on services. And that's where you're going to see the biggest hit. Now, if you're manufacturing, right? If you're manufacturing stuff that you can export, you're going to benefit from that. Your costs, some of your costs will go up. Your labor costs are going to collapse, right? Because the wages that you're paying your workers have crashed because the dollars have crashed. Your raw material costs, they could go up because you're globally, when you're a business, you're competing globally for resources, raw materials, but labor is pretty much captive, right? So if I'm a worker and I'm in, Illinois, and, my choices for employers are there. I can't go to Japan if they have higher wages. I can't just up and move to Japan. I just got to accept, the kind of the best job that's within my reach. So wages are going to come way down in America on a global scale. And so that will help a lot of businesses become more productive, factories and so maybe companies that now are producing goods and selling in America, they'll start shipping those goods abroad and selling them to foreigners and making them here. So that will help. So those industries will do better. That's why if I was going to be investing in the US, I would want to invest in businesses that produce products or services that are in demand outside the United States, that could be sold, exported. So that part of the economy is going to do better. Unfortunately, that's a smaller part of our economy, right? So much of it is based on, distribution of imports. And even a lot of, service sector jobs where they're not selling goods, where they're providing products, a lot of the stuff that they use in the provision of those services are imported. And of course, energy is just going to go way up because even the energy that we produce ourselves, if the dollar crashes, most of the energy that we produce, we're just going to export it to other countries because those people can pay more, right? We don't just compete with one another, we compete with the whole world. And so right now, we're at a competitive advantage with the world. We've got strong dollars and we outbid a lot of people for resources. A lot of resources we get because we could pay more because the dollar is worth more. Well, when the dollar collapses, all of a sudden we're going to get outbid for a lot of things that we used to be able to afford. So it's going to be very disruptive to go back to reality. But, in the long run, of course, the sooner we do that, the better, because the longer it takes, the worse it's going to be, right? It's like we're in this giant hole and we just keep digging and digging and digging. Eventually, we're going to have to be, confronted and get out of this hole. So let's stop digging, right? That's the first rule of holes, right? When you're in one, you stop digging. Well, that's what we have to do. As of now, we're continuing to dig this Grand Canyon of holes, and we're making it even deeper. I think most people are completely ill-prepared. They're in the indexes in the U.S. They maybe their 60-40 portfolio. They've got a lot of overpriced U.S. tech stocks. They got a bunch of money in U.S. dollar-denominated bonds. I think these portfolios are going to get destroyed the way they did in the 1970s. People that followed the investment prescription of the 1960s that worked great in the 50s and 60s. It was the Nifty 50, it was the Xerox and the Polaroids and all these stocks. They got decimated in the 1970s. But if you had a portfolio of resource stocks, gold and silver, oil, if you invested in Japan, in emerging markets in the late 60s, or you killed it during the 1970s. So I think this is going to be the 1970s on steroids. And another thing that happened too as a result of the 1970s, that's why so many women ended up working in the 1980s and the 1990s. They didn't work in the 50s and 60s, married women, because their husbands could afford to support them. But they lost so much money due to the inflation of the 1970s that now one paycheck couldn't support a family. So now you had all these women that had to join the labor force to earn the money that their husbands lost. They lost it to inflation. They lost it to taxes. And that's been part of the degradation in our standard of living. A lot of people, when they think, we haven't suffered a crisis, we have, because we've destroyed a family. We have two people that have to work, and now they don't even have one job. Now we have two people working 4 or 5 jobs, and they can't even make ends meet. Not only do you have the husband and wife both working second and third jobs, but they have no savings and they have massive credit card debt. You didn't have that. People didn't have credit card debt in the 1950s, 1960s. They had savings. So people are not, are overlooking the financial collapse that has happened. And we're just living off of extra labor and extra debt. But this whole thing is going to implode. But you definitely want to do what you can, right? I can't stop this from happening. It's pretty much inevitable. I could just brace for the impact of the collapse, and I can protect to the best of my ability the value of my assets, right? My savings. I can get them out of harm's way. I can get them into quality stocks around the world, get good dividends. So that's what you should do. And so you contact me there at Europe Pacific Asset Management. It's europac.com is the website. There's a phone number there. You can, just call us up or send us an email or something, and somebody will get back to you and start, going over the way that we can help, improve your portfolio and get it into the types of assets that did very well in the 1970s and that I think will do even better in the decade ahead.